Thank you for listening to our audiobooks. We do our best to regularly upload quality books with clear narrations. Please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell icon so we can bring you more great books. Thank you very much and enjoy your audiobook.
When I threw open the door, Amber was always there, waiting to welcome me, her forefeet resting on the plywood sheet, her long yellow ears gleaming in the bright beam. That is my picture of her to this day. Her temperament never altered, and her tail swished the straw unceasingly as I did all the uncomfortable things to her, rubbing the tender skin with the lotion, injecting her with the staph toxoid, taking further skin scrapings to check progress. As the days and the weeks went by and I saw no improvement, I became a little desperate. I gave her sulphur baths and Derris baths, although I had done no good with such things in the past, and I also began to go through all the proprietary things on the market. In veterinary practice, every resistant disease spawns a multitude of quack cures, and I lost count of the shampoos and washes I swilled over the young animal in the hope that there might be some magic element in them despite my misgivings. These nightly sessions under the headlights became part of my life, and I think I might have gone on blindly for an indefinite period until one very dark evening, with the rain beating on the cobbles of the yard, I seemed to see the young dog for the first time. The condition had spread over the entire body, leaving only tufts and straggling wisps of hair. The long ears were golden no longer. They were almost bald, as was the rest of her face and head. Everywhere her skin was thickened and wrinkled and had assumed a bluish tinge, and when I squeezed it, a slow ooze of pus and serum came up round my fingers. I flopped back and sat down in the straw while Amber leapt around me, licking and wagging. Despite her terrible state, her nature was unchanged. But this couldn't go on. I knew now that she and I had come to the end of the road. As I tried to think, I stroked her head, and her cheerful eyes were pathetic in the scarecrow face. My misery was compounded of various things. I had grown too fond of her. I had failed, and she had nobody, only Sister Rose and myself. And that was another thing. What was I going to tell that good lady after all my brave words? It took me until the following lunchtime to summon the will to telephone her. In my effort to be matter-of-fact about the thing, I fear I was almost brusque. "Sister," I said, "I'm afraid it's all over with Amber. I've tried everything, and she has got worse all the time. I do think it would be the kindest thing to put her to sleep." Shock was evident in her voice. "But it seems so awful. Just for a skin disease." "I know, that's what everybody thinks. But this is a dreadful thing. In its worst form, it can ruin an animal's life. Amber must be very uncomfortable now, and soon she's going to be in pain. We can't let her go on." "Oh, well, I trust your judgment, Mr. Herriot. I know you wouldn't do anything that wasn't necessary." There was a long pause, and I knew she was trying to control her voice. Then she spoke calmly. "I think I would like to come out and see her when I can get away from the hospital." "Please, sister," I said gently. "I'd much rather you didn't." Again the pause, then, "Very well, Mr. Herriot. I leave everything to you." I had an urgent visit immediately afterwards, and a rush of work kept me going all afternoon. I never really stopped thinking about what I had to do later, but at least the other pressures stopped it from obsessing me. It was, as always, pitch dark when I drove into the yard and opened the garage doors. And it was like all the other times. Amber was there in the beam, paws on the plywood, body swinging with her wagging, mouth open and panting with delight, welcoming me. I put the barbiturate and syringe into my pocket before climbing into the pen. For a long time I made a fuss of her, patting her and talking to her as she leapt up at me. Then I filled the syringe. "Sit, girl," I said, and she flopped obediently onto her hind quarters. I gripped her right leg above the elbow to raise the radial vein. There was no need for clipping. All the hair had gone. Amber looked at me interestedly, wondering what new game this might be as I slipped the needle into the vein. I realized that there was no need to say the things I always said. She won't know a thing. This is just an overdose of anesthetic. It's an easy way out for her. There was no sorrowing owner to hear me. There were just the two of us. And as I murmured, "Good girl, Amber. Good lass," as she sank down on the straw, I had the conviction that if I had said those things, they would have been true. She didn't know a thing between her playfulness and oblivion, and it was indeed an easy way out from that prison which would soon become a torture chamber. I stepped from the pen and switched off the car lights, and in the cold darkness the yard had never seemed so empty. After the weeks of struggle, the sense of loss and of failure was overpowering. But at the end, I was at least able to spare Amber the ultimate miseries, the internal abscesses and septicemia, which await a dog suffering from a progressive and incurable demodectic mange. For a long time I carried a weight around with me, and I feel some of it now after all these years, because the tragedy of Amber was that she was born too soon. At the present time, we can cure most cases of demodectic mange by a long course of organophosphates and antibiotics, but neither of these things were available then when I needed them. It is still a dread condition, but we have fought patiently with our modern weapons and won most. Chapter 16. "Just look at that," the farmer said. "At what?" I was cleansing a cow, removing the afterbirth, and my arm was buried deep in the cow's uterus. I turned my head to see him pointing to the byre floor beneath my patient. I saw 4 white jets of milk spurting onto the concrete from the animal's udder. He grinned. "That's a funny thing, isn't it?" "Well, it isn't really," I said. "It's a reflex action caused by my hand twiddling the uterus about. This acts on a gland in the brain which causes the milk to flow. I often see cows letting their milk down like that when I'm cleansing them." "Well, that's a rum 'un," the farmer laughed. "Any road. You better get finished quick or you'll have a few pints of milk to knock off your bill." That was in 1947, the year of the Great Snow. I have never known snow like that before or since, and the odd thing was that it took such a long time to get started. Nothing happened in November, and we had a green Christmas, but then it began to get colder and colder. All through January a northeast wind blew, apparently straight from the Arctic, and usually after a few days of this sort of unbearable blast, snow would come and make things a bit warmer. But not in 1947. Each day we thought it couldn't get any colder, but it did. And then, borne on the wind, very fine flakes began to appear over the last few days of the month. They were so small you could hardly see them, but they were the forerunners of the real thing. At the beginning of February, big, fat flakes started a steady, relentless descent on our countryside, and we knew after all that build-up that we were for it. For weeks and weeks the snow fell, sometimes in a gentle, almost lazy curtain which remorselessly obliterated the familiar landmarks, at others in fierce blizzards. In between, the frost took over and transformed the roads into glassy tracks of flattened snow, over which we drove at 15 miles an hour. The long garden at Skeldale House disappeared under a white blanket. There was a single deep channel by the wall side where I fought my way daily to my car in the yard at the top. The yard itself had to be dug out every day, and the opening of the big double doors into the yard was a back-breaking job. One day I found the doors were jammed immovably in high mounds of frozen snow. There was nothing I could do about it, so they were left standing open for the rest of the winter. To get to our cases, we did a lot of walking, since so many of the farm tracks were blocked wall to wall. On the very high country, there were some farms which we couldn't reach at all, and that was very sad because there was no doubt that many animals died for lack of veterinary help. It was around the middle of March, when helicopters were dropping food on these isolated spots, that Bert Keeley telephoned me. He was one of those who was out of reach on a high moor which was bleak even in summertime, and I was surprised to hear his voice. "I thought your phone wires would be down, Bert," I said. "No, they've survived. God knows how." The young farmer's voice was cheerful as always. He ran a small suckling herd on the high tops, and was one of the many who scratched a living from the unfriendly soil. "But I'm in trouble," he went on. "Polly's just had a litter, and she hasn't a drop of milk." "Oh dear, that's unfortunate," I said. Polly was the only pig on the Keeley farm. "Aye, it's a beggar. Bad enough losing litter. There's 12 smashing little pigs. But it's Tess I'm bothered about." "Yes, yes." I was thinking of Tess too. She was Bert's 8-year-old daughter, and she had a thing about little pigs. She had persuaded her father to buy her an in-pig sow for her birthday, so that she could have a litter of her own. I could remember Tess's excitement when she showed me her birthday gift a few days after its arrival. "That's Polly Pig," she said, pointing to the sow nuzzling the straw in its pen. "She's mine. My dad gave her to me." I leant over the pen. "Yes, I know. You're a lucky girl. She looks a fine pig to me." "Oh, she is, she is." The little girl's eyes shone with pleasure. "I feed her every day, and she lets me stroke her. She's nice." "I bet she is. She looks nice." "Yes, and you know something else?" Tess's face grew serious and her look took on a conspiratorial tone. "She's going to have babies in March." "Well, I never," I said. "Is that so? You'll have a whole lot of little pink pigs to look after." I held my hand a few inches apart. "Just about this size." She was so thrilled at the thought that she was lost for words. She just smiled happily, got hold of the wall of the pen and began to jump up and down. All this came back to me as I listened to Bert Keeley's voice on the phone. "Do you think she's got mastitis, Bert? Is the udder red and swollen? Is she off her food?" "No, not like that. She's eating her head off, and her udder's not a bit inflamed." "Well then, it's a straight case of agalactia. She needs a shot of pituitrin, but how the heck's she going to get it? Your district's been cut off for weeks now." It takes a lot to make a Yorkshire farmer admit that his farm is inaccessible because of the weather, but these were exceptional circumstances, and Bert had to agree. "I know," he said. "I've tried digging my road out, but it fills up as fast as I clear it. Anyway, top road's blocked for 2 miles, so I'm wasting my time." I thought for a moment. "Have you tried getting some cow's milk into the piglet? An egg mixed with a quart of milk and a teaspoon of glucose isn't a bad milk substitute. I know you've got some glucose for those scouring calves." "I've tried 'em with that," Bert replied. "Put it in a Yorkshire pudding tin and dip their noses in it, but they wouldn't look at it. If only they could have a good suck at their mother and get somewhat into their bellies, it would start them off, and then they'd maybe have a go at substitute." He was right. There was nothing to compare with that first suck. And if they didn't get it, those tiny creatures with their empty stomachs would start dying at an alarming rate. "Looks like they're all going to go down to Nick," Bert said. "I don't know what little Tess is going to say. She'll be heartbroken." I tapped my fingers against the receiver. An idea was forming in my mind. "There's just one possibility," I said. "I know I can get to the top of Denner Bank because the road is open to there. After that, it's all flat going to your place. I could maybe get there on skis." "Skis?" "Yes, I've been doing a bit of that lately. But I've not tackled anywhere as far off as your farm. I can't be sure that I'll make it, but I'll try." "By heck, I'd be grateful if you would, Mr. Herriot. It's little lass I'm thinking of." "Same here, Bert. Anyway, I'll have a go. I'll leave now. Leave now. Leave now." On the summit of Denner Bank, I manoeuvred my car as close as possible to the tall white walls which the snowplows had thrown up, got out and buckled on my skis. I have to admit I was beginning to fancy myself a bit on skis, because one bonus of the long spell of snow and frost was that some nice slopes had become available. With a few other enthusiasts, I had been rushing out to the hillsides at every opportunity, and I had found that gliding down again and again in the frosty air was one of the most exhilarating things I had ever known. I had bought a book on the subject, and thought I was becoming quite skillful. All I needed was the bottle of pituitrin and a syringe, and I put them in my pocket. To get to the Keeley farm in normal conditions, you drove a couple of miles along a very straight road, turned right, and made for the high-lying village of Branderby. Bert's farm lay in an isolated position about halfway along this second road. But today, although I had travelled this region 100 times, I might have been in a strange country, somewhere I had never seen before. The stone walls had been deeply engulfed, so there were no fields, no roads, nothing, but a yawning white expanse, with the tops of telegraph poles sticking up here and there. It was uncanny. Without skis, there was no saying how far I might have sunk into the billowing drifts. I felt a twinge of misgiving, but I had promised to try. Anyway, I would be able to travel cross-country. It would be like cutting off two sides of a triangle, and I was pretty sure the farm lay in one of the hollows just below the dark skyline. I'm afraid this is not a glorious episode in my history. I had slithered amateurishly for about half a mile when the snow started again. It seemed to come from nowhere, and was by no means a blizzard, just a white veil which cut me off completely from my surroundings. There was no point in going on because I had lost all sense of direction. The swirling screen of flakes was impenetrable. There is no disguising the fact that I was scared. As I stood stock still in the cold with my eyes half closed, I wondered what would happen to me if the snow didn't stop. In fact, I still wonder about that, because I could have blundered for miles in that empty wilderness without coming upon a house. It is a question which will never be answered, because the flurry stopped as suddenly as it had begun. My heart thumped as I stared around me, and the dark smudge of my car roof in the white distance was a sweet sight. I headed back to it with a speed worthy of an Olympic skier, and I am sure my eyes were popping as I kept them fixed on my link with home. Relief flowed through me as I threw my skis into the back and started the engine. And I had left Dennerbank behind and was well on the way to Dannerby before my pulse rate returned to normal. "Bert," I said on the phone, "I'm terribly sorry, but I just couldn't make it. I got caught by a snow shower and had to turn back." "Well, I'm glad you did turn. I've been a bit worried since you left. Fellas have got lost and died in the snow up here. I shouldn't have let you try." He paused for a moment, then said wistfully, "If only there was some other way to make Polly let her milk down." As he spoke, the picture flashed into my mind of that cow I was cleansing and the white jets striking the byre floor. And there were other memories. When I was doing some uterine examination on sows, the same thing had happened. "Maybe there is a way," I blurted out. "What do you mean?" "Bert, have you ever had your hand inside a sow?" "Eh? Have you ever examined a sow internally?" "You mean in her pig bed?" "Yes." Nay, I'll leave that to you chaps." "Well, I want you to start now. Get some warm water and some soap and—" "Hey, hang on, Mr. Herriot. I'm sure there's no more pigs left in her." "I don't suppose there are, Bert, but do as I say. Soap your arm well and use any household antiseptic you have. Then feel your way into the vagina until you come to the cervix. She's only just farrowed, so the cervix should still be open. Put a finger inside and waggle the pig bed around a bit." "Oh, heck, I don't fancy this. What's it all about?" "It often brings the milk down. That's what it's about. So get going." I put down the phone and went through to have lunch. Helen kept glancing at me during the meal as I answered little Jimmy's questions in a preoccupied way. She knew something was on my mind, and I don't suppose she was surprised when I leapt to my feet at the sound of the phone ringing. It was Bert. He sounded breathless, but triumphant. "It worked, Mr. Herriot. I had a good waggle around, like you said. Then I tried the udder. I could draw milk out of every tit, and there wasn't a drop there before. It was like magic. Are the piglets feeling? Not half. They were fighting to get a drink before, but they're all laid quiet in a row, sucking hard. It's lovely to see them." "Well, that's great," I said, "but we haven't won yet. The piglets have had that vital first feed, but Polly will probably dry up again by tomorrow, or even tonight. You'll have to get your hand in again." "Oh, crumbs." A lot of the enthusiasm went out of Bert's voice. I thought I'd finished with that. The poor man did indeed have to perform his unusual task several times, and, in fact, Polly never did come fully to her milk. But the piglets were kept going until they were able to drink the milk substitute from the tin. The litter was saved. The great snow of 1947 was followed by the most glorious summer I can remember. But in late April, in the high country, the white streak still lay behind the walls, standing out against the green moorland like the ribs of a great beast. But the roads were clear, and my journey to see one of Bert Keeley's heifers had none of the drama of last time. When I had finished my job, young Tess took me through to see her beloved Polly and family. "They're pretty, aren't they?" she said as we looked into the pen of the 12 chunky little pigs playing around their mother. "They certainly are, Tess," I replied. "Your first attempt at pig breeding has been a big success. But I really think you have to thank your father for it. He did a wonderful job." Bert gave a wry smile, then screwed up his face at the memory. "Aye, maybe so, and I reckon it was worth it. But I tell you, I didn't enjoy it." Chapter 17. "Are you all right, Helen?" I looked round anxiously as my wife fidgeted in her seat. We were in the 1 and 9 in the Scala Cinema in Broughton, and I had a strong conviction that we had no right to be there. I had voiced my doubts that morning. "I know it's our half-day, Helen, but with the baby due any time, don't you think it would be safer to stay around Darrowby?" "No, of course not." Helen laughed incredulously at the very idea of missing our outing, and I could see her point, because it was an oasis of relaxation in our busy lives. For me, it was an escape from the telephone, and the mud, and the Wellington boots, and for my wife it meant a rest from her own hard slog, plus the luxury of having meals cooked and served by somebody else. "But honestly," I said, "what if the thing comes on quickly? It's all right you laughing. We don't want our second child to be born in Smith's bookshop, or the back of a car." The whole business had me worried. I wasn't as bad as when Jimmy was on his way. I was in the RAF then, and I went into a sort of decline during which I lost 2 stones in weight, which wasn't all due to the hard training. People make jokes about this syndrome, but I didn't find it funny. There was something about having babies which really got through to me, and lately I had spent a lot of time flapping around, watching Helen's every move, much to her amusement. I just couldn't calm down about the thing. There isn't much of the yogi in my makeup at any time, and over the last 2 days the tension had built up. But Helen had been adamant this morning. She wasn't going to be done out of her half-day by such a trifle. And now here we were, in the La Scala with Humphrey Bogart, competing vainly for my attention, and my blood pressure rising steadily as my wife squirmed around and occasionally ran a thoughtful hand over her swollen abdomen. As I scrutinized her keenly from the corner of my eye, she gave a convulsive jerk and her lips parted in a soft moan. An instant dew of perspiration had already sprung out all over me before she turned and whispered, "I think we'd better go now, Jim." Stumbling over the outstretched legs in the darkness, I guided her up the sloping aisle, and such was my panic that I felt sure the crisis would be upon us before we reached the usherette standing at the back with her torch. I was thankful to reach the street and see our little car standing only a few yards away. As we set off, I seemed to notice the rattles and bumpings of the old springs for the first time. It was the only time in my life that I wished I had a Rolls Royce. The 25 miles to Darrowby seemed to take an eternity. Helen sat very quiet by my side, occasionally closing her eyes and catching her breath, while my heart beat a tattoo against my ribs. When we reached our little town, I turned the car to the right towards the marketplace. Helen looked at me in surprise. "Where are you going?" "Well, to Nurse Brown's, of course." "Oh, don't be so silly. It's not time for that yet." "But how do you know?" "I just know." Helen laughed. "I've had a baby before, don't you remember? Come on, let's go home." Heavy with misgiving, I drove to Scaledale House, and as we mounted the stairs, I marvelled at Helen's composure. It was the same when we got into bed. She lay there, obviously not very comfortable, but quite patient, and there was about her a calm acceptance of the inevitable, which I could not share. I suppose I kept dropping into what is termed a fitful slumber because it was 6 a.m. when she nudged my arm. "Time to go, Jim." Her tone was very matter-of-fact. I shot from the bed like a jack-in-the-box, threw on my clothes and shouted across the landing to Aunt Lucy, who was staying with us for the occasion. "We're off!" A faint reply came through the door. "All right. I'll see to Jimmy." When I returned to our bedroom, Helen was dressing methodically. "Get that suitcase out of the cupboard, Jim," she said. I opened the cupboard door. "Suitcase?" "Yes, that one. It's got my nighties and toilet things and baby clothes and everything I'll need." Go on, bring it out. Suppressing a groan, I carried the case out and stood waiting. I had missed all this last time because of the war, and had often regretted it, but at that moment I wasn't at all sure whether I wouldn't rather be elsewhere. Outside, it was a glorious May morning, the air limpid with the new day freshness, which had soothed the irritation of many an early call. But it was all lost on me today as I drove across the empty marketplace. We had only about half a mile to go, and I was pulling up outside Greenside Nursing Home within minutes. There was a touch of grandeur about the name, but in fact it was just the small dwelling house of Nurse Brown. Upstairs there were a couple of bedrooms which for many years had seen the arrival of the local children. I knocked at the door and pushed it open. Nurse Brown gave me a quick smile, put her arm round Helen's shoulders, and led her upstairs. I was left in the kitchen, feeling strangely alone and helpless, but a voice cut in on my jumbled thoughts. "Now then, Jim, it's a grand morning." It was Cliff, Nurse Brown's husband. He was sitting in the corner of the kitchen eating his breakfast, and he spoke to me casually as though we had encountered each other in the street. He wore the broad grin which never seemed to leave his face, but I suppose I half expected that he would leap from the table, seize my hand and say, "There, there," or something of the sort. However, he continued to work his way phlegmatically through the stack of bacon, eggs, sausages and tomatoes on his plate, and I realized that over the years he must have seen hundreds of quivering husbands standing in that kitchen. It was old stuff to Cliff. "Yes, Cliff. Yes," I replied. "I think it will turn out hot later." He nodded absently and pushed his plate to one side to join an empty porridge bowl before turning his attention to bread and marmalade. Nurse Brown was a noted cook as well as a baby expert, and it was evident that she believed in ensuring that her husband, a very big man and a lorry driver for one of the local contractors, would not grow faint from hunger during the morning. Watching him slapping on the marmalade, I cringed inwardly at the creaking sounds from the floorboards above. What was happening in that bedroom? As he chewed, Cliff seemed to notice that I was perhaps one of the more distraught type of husbands, because he turned his big, kind smile on me. He was and is one of the nicest men in our town, and he spoke gently. "Don't worry, lad," he said. "It'll be all right." His words were mildly soothing, and I fled. In those days it was unheard of for the husbands to be present at the birth, and though it is now the in thing to observe it all, I marvel at the fortitude of these young men. I know beyond all doubt that Herriot would be carried away unconscious at some time during the proceedings. When Siegfried arrived at the surgery, he was very thoughtful. "You'd better stick around, James. I'll get through the morning round on my own. Take it quietly, my boy. All will be well." It was difficult to take it quietly. I found that expectant fathers really did pace the floor for long periods, and I varied this by trying to read the newspaper upside down. It was around 11 o'clock when the long-awaited telephone call came. It was my doctor and good friend, Harry Allinson. Harry always spoke in a sort of cheerful shout, and his very presence in a sick room was a tonic. This morning the booming voice was like the sweetest music. "A sister for Jimmy!" His words were followed by a burst of laughter. "Oh, great, Harry. Thank you. Thank you. That's marvellous news." I held the receiver against my chest for a few moments before putting it down. I walked with dragging steps to the sitting room and lay back in a chair until my nerves had stopped vibrating. Then, on an impulse, I leapt to my feet. I believe I have said before that I am a fairly sensible man with a propensity for doing daft things, and I decided that I had to go round to the nursing home immediately. At that time, my husband was not welcome straight after the birth. I knew it because I had gone to see Jimmy too soon and had not been well received. But still, I went. When I burst into her establishment, Nurse Brown's usual smile was absent. "You've done it again, haven't you?" she said with some asperity. "I told you with Jimmy that you should have given us time to get the baby washed, but it seems you took no notice." I hung my head sheepishly and she relented. "Oh, well, now you're here, you might as well come upstairs." Helen had the same tired, flushed look that I remembered before. I kissed her thankfully. We didn't say anything, just smiled at each other. Then I had a look in the cot by the bed. Nurse Brown regarded me with tight lips and narrowed eyes as I peered down. Last time I had been so aghast at Jimmy's appearance that I had mortally offended her by asking if there was anything wrong with him, and heaven help me, I felt the same now. I won't go into details, but the new little girl's face was all squashed and red and bloated, and the sense of shock hit me as it had done before. I looked up at the nurse, and it was only too clear that she was waiting for me to say something derogatory. Her normally laughing face was set in a threatening scowl. One wrong word from me and she would have kicked me on the shins. I was sure of that. "Gorgeous," I said weakly. "Really gorgeous." "All right." She had seen enough of me. "Out you go." She ushered me downstairs, and as she opened the outside door, she fixed me with a piercing eye. That bright little woman could read me without effort. She spoke slowly and deliberately, as though addressing a person of limited intelligence. "That is a lovely, healthy baby," she said, and closed the door in my face. And bless her heart, her words helped me, because as I drove away I knew she must be right. And now, all those years later, when I look at my handsome son and my beautiful daughter, I can hardly believe my own stupidity. When I returned to the surgery, there was one visit waiting for me, high in the hills, and the journey up there was like a happy dream. My worry was over, and it seemed that all nature was rejoicing with me. It was the 9th of May, 1947, the beginning of the most perfect summer I can remember. The sun blazed. Soft breezes swirled into the car, carrying their fragrance from the fells around. An elusive breath of the bluebells, primroses and violets, scattered everywhere on the grass and flowing among the shadows of the trees. After I had seen my patient, I took a walk on the high tops along a favourite path of beaten earth on the hill's edge, with Sam trotting at my heels. I looked away over the rolling patchwork of the plain, sleeping in the sun's haze, and at the young bracken on the hillside springing straight and green from last year's dead brown stalks. Everywhere new life was calling out its exultant message, and it was so apt with my new little daughter lying down there in Darrowby. We had decided to call her Rosemary. It is such a pretty name, and I still love it, but it didn't last long. It became Rosie at a very early stage, and though I did make one or two ineffectual stands, it has remained so to this day. She is now Dr. Rosie in our community. On that May day, I caught myself just in time. It has always been my practice to recline in the sunshine on the springy bed of heather which clusters on these hillsides, and I was just settling down when I remembered I had other things to do today. I sped back to Scaledale House and began to telephone my glad news all over the country. It was received rapturously by all, but it was Tristan who grasped the essentials of the situation. "We've got to wet this baby's head, Jim," he said seriously. I was ready for anything. Of course, of course. "When are you coming over?" "I'll be there at 7, he replied crisply, and I knew he would be. Tristan was concerned about the venue of the celebration. There were 4 of us in the sitting room at Scaledale House: Siegfried, Tristan, Alex Taylor, and myself. Alex was my oldest friend. We started school together in Glasgow at the age of 4, and when he came out of the army after 5 years in the Western Desert in Italy, he came to spend a few weeks with Helen and me in Darrowby. It wasn't long before he had fallen under the spell of the country life, and now he was learning farming and a state agency with a view to starting a new career. It was good that he should be with me tonight. Tristan's fingers drummed on the arm of his chair as he thought aloud. His expression was fixed and grave, his eyes vacant. "We'd normally go to the Drovers, but they've got that big party on tonight, so that's no good," he muttered. "We want a bit of peace and quiet. Let's see now. There's the George and Dragon, Tetley's beer, splendid stuff, but I've known them a bit careless with their pipes, and I've had the odd sour mouthful. And of course we have the Cross Keys. They pull a lovely pint of Cameron's, and the draft Guinness is excellent. And we mustn't forget the Hare and Pheasant. Their bitter can rise to great heights, although the mild is ordinary." He paused for a moment. "We might do worse than the Lord Nelson. Very reliable ale, and of course there's always—" "Just a minute, Tris," I broke in. "I went round to Nurse Brown's this evening to see Helen, and Cliff asked if he could come with us. Don't you think it would be rather nice to go to his pub, since the baby was born in his house?" Tristan narrowed his eyes. "Which pub is that?" The Black Horse. Ah, yes, yes. Tristan looked at me thoughtfully and put his fingertips together. Russell and Wrangham's. A good little brewery, that. I've had some first-rate pints in the Black Horse, though I've noticed a slight loss of nuttiness under very warm conditions. He looked anxiously out of the window. It's been hot today. Perhaps we'd... Oh, for heaven's sake! Siegfried leapt to his feet. You sound like an analytical chemist. It's only beer you're talking about, after all. Tristan looked at him in shocked silence, but Siegfried turned to me briskly. I think that's a pleasant idea of yours, James. Let's go with Cliff to the Black Horse. It's a quiet little place. And indeed, as we dropped to the chairs in the bar parlour, I felt we had chosen the ideal spot. The evening sunshine sent long golden shafts over the pitted oak tables and the high back settles where a few farm men sat with their glasses. There was nothing smart about this little inn, but the furniture, which hadn't been changed for 100 years, gave it an air of tranquility. It was just right. Reg Wilkie, the diminutive landlord, welcomed us and charged our glasses from his tall white jug. Siegfried raised his pint. James, may I be the first to wish a long life, health and happiness to Rosemary. Thank you, Siegfried, I said, feeling suddenly very much among friends as the others said, Hear, hear, and began to drink. Cliff, his face wreathed in his eternal smile, lowered the level in his glass by half, then turned to the landlord. It gets better, Reg, he said reverently. It gets better. As Reg bowed modestly, Cliff said, You know, Jim, I've said for years that me two best friends are Mr. Russell and Mr. Wrangham. I think the world of 'em. Everybody laughed, and the stage was set for a happy celebration. With my anxieties over, I felt wonderful. After a couple of pints, Siegfried patted me on the shoulder. I'm off, James. Have a good time. Can't tell you how pleased I am. I watched him go, and I didn't argue. He was right. There was a veterinary practice out there, and somebody had to watch the shop. And this was my night. It was one of those cosy evenings when everything seemed perfect. Alex and I recalled our childhood in Glasgow. Tristan came up with some splendid memories of Skeldale House in the bachelor days, and over everything, like a beneficent moon, hung the huge smile of Cliff Brown. A great love of my fellow men mounted in me, and I kept buying drinks for the local people around us. Finally, I grew tired of fumbling for money and handed my wallet to the landlord. It was stuffed with notes because I had made a special visit to the bank that afternoon. Here, Reg, I said, just keep taking the drinks out of that. Aye, right, Mr. Herriot, he replied without changing expression. It'll make it easier. It did make it a lot easier. Men whom I hardly knew raised their glasses and toasted my new daughter repeatedly, and all I had to do was smile and raise mine in return. When closing time was announced, it didn't seem possible that it was all coming to an end. As the little pub emptied, I approached the landlord. We can't go home yet, Reg. He looked at me quizzically. Well, you know the law, Mr. Herriot. Yes, but this is a special night, isn't it? Aye, it is, I suppose. He hesitated for a moment. Tell you what, I'll lock up. Then we could go down and have one or two in the cellar, just to finish off. I put my arm round his shoulders. Reg, what a delightful idea. Let's go down there. We descended a few steps into the pub cellar, switched on the light, and pulled the trapdoor closed after us. As we disposed ourselves among the barrels and crates, I looked around the company. Apart from the original four, we were now augmented by two young farmers, one of the local grocers, and an official from the Darrowby Water Board. We were a warmly knit little group. It was much easier down there. No need to bother the landlord with his jug. We just went to a barrel and turned the tap. Still plenty in the wallet, Reg? I shouted. Aye, there's plenty here, don't worry. Help yourselves. We kept doing that, and the party never flagged. It must have been past midnight when we heard the thumping on the outside door. Reg listened for a few moments, then went upstairs. He returned soon, but was preceded through the trapdoor by the long blue legs, tunic, cadaverous face and helmet of Police Constable Hubert Goole. A silence fell on the merry gathering as the constable's melancholy gaze passed slowly over us. "Drinking a bit late, aren't you?" he inquired, tonelessly. "Ah, well!" Tristan gave a gay little laugh. "It's a special occasion, you see, Mr. Goole. Mr. Herriot's wife gave birth to a daughter this morning." "Oh, aye." The Old Testament countenance looked down on my friend from its bony perch. "I don't remember Mr. Wilkie applying for an extended license for tonight." It was the nearest he could get to making a joke, because P.C. Goole never made jokes. He was known in the town as a stern and unbending man, one who went by the book. It was no good riding a bike at night without lights when P.C. Goole was around. He was particularly merciless on this offence. He sang in the church choir, his morals were impeccable. He was active in community work. He did everything right. It was strange that in his mid-50s he was still an ordinary constable. Tristan bounced back. "Oh, yes. Ha ha ha! Very good. But of course this was a totally impromptu thing. Spur of the moment, you know." "You can call it what you like, but you're breaking the law and you know it." The big man unbuttoned his breast pocket and flipped open his notebook. "I'll have to have your names." I was sitting on an upturned crate and I gripped my knees tightly. What an end to the happy evening. Nothing much happened in the town, and this would make headlines in the Dallaby and Hulton Times. It would look great, with all my friends involved too, and poor little Reg standing sheepishly in the background. He would really get it in the neck, and it was all my fault. Tristan, however, was not beaten yet. "Mr. Goole," he said coldly, "I'm disappointed in you." "Eh?" "I said I'm disappointed. I'd have expected you to show a different attitude on an occasion like this." The constable was unmoved. He poised his pencil. "I'm a policeman, Mr. Farnan, and I have my duty to do. We might as well start with your name." He wrote carefully, then looked up. "What's your address now?" "It seems to me," said Tristan, ignoring the question, "that you have forgotten all about little Julie." "What about Julie?" The long face showed a certain animation for the first time. Tristan's mention of P.C. Gould's beloved Yorkshire Terrier had found a tender spot. "Well, as I recall," Tristan went on, "Mr. Herriot sat up for several hours during the night with Julie when she was having pups. In fact, if it hadn't been for him, you might have lost the pups and Julie too. I know it's a few years ago, but I remember it distinctly." "Now then, that has got naught to do with tonight. I've told you I have me duty to do." He turned to the official of the water board. Tristan returned to the attack. "Yes, but surely you can have a drink with us on a night like this, when Mr. Herriot has become a father for the second time? It's the same thing in a way." P.C. Goole paused, and his face softened. "Julie's still going strong." "Yes, I know," I said. "Wonderful little thing for her age." "And I still have one of them pups." "Of course. You've had him in to see me a few times." "Aye." "Aye." P.C. Goole hitched up his tunic, delved in his trouser pocket, and brought out a large watch. He studied it thoughtfully. "Well, I'm off duty about now. Suppose I could have a drink with you. I'll just phone into the office first." "Oh, good!" Tristan moved quickly to the barrel and drew another pint. When the constable returned from the phone, he raised the glass solemnly. "Here's wishing little lass all the best," he said, and took a long swallow. "Thank you, Mr. Goole," I said. "You're very kind." He sat down on one of the lower steps, placed his helmet on a crate, and had another deep drink. "Both well, I hope?" "Yes, just grand." "Have another." It was surprising to see how soon he seemed to forget all about his notebook, and the party picked up again rapidly. The relief of the escape added greatly to the festivities, and joy reigned unrestrained. "It's bloody hot down here," P.C. Goole remarked after some time, and removed his tunic. With this symbolic gesture, the last barrier went down. And yet, over the next 2 hours, nobody got really plastered. Nobody, that is, except PC Ghoul. With the rest of us, it was a case of laughter, reminiscing, and an undoubted heightening of the senses. But the policeman passed through various stages on the road to a fairly profound inebriation. The first was when he insisted on a Christian-name relationship. Then he became almost tearfully affectionate as he rhapsodized on the wonders of birth, human and canine. The latest phase was more sinister. He was turning aggressive. "You're having another, Jim?" It was a statement rather than an inquiry as the tall, shirt-sleeved figure bent, swaying slightly over the tap of the barrel, glass at the ready. "No thanks, Hubert," I replied. "I've had enough." He blinked at me owlishly. "You're not having another?" "No, honestly, Hubert, I've had it. I started long before you." He sent another pint frothing into his glass before continuing. "Then you're a bloody piker, Jim," he said. "And if there's one thing I can't stand, if there's one thing I can't bloody stand, it's a bloody piker." I tried an ingratiating smile. "I'm terribly sorry, Hubert, but I'm up to here. And anyway, it's 2:30. I really think we ought to be going." It seemed to be a general sentiment, because the assembly all began to get to their feet. "Going?" Hubert glared at me belligerently. "What's the matter with you? The night's young yet." He slurped down another mouthful of beer indignantly. "You ask a fella to have a drink with you, and next minute you say we're going? It's not right." Now, Hubert," said little Reg Wilkie, sidling up to him, smiling and radiating the bonhomie which came from 30 years' practice at easing reluctant clients from his premises. "Be a good lad now. We've all had a grand time, and it's been lovely seeing you, but everybody's setting off home. Now, where's your jacket?" The constable muttered and grumbled as we helped him into his tunic and balanced his helmet on his head, but allowed us to lead him up the steps into the darkness of the pub. Outside, I installed him in the back of my car with Tristan and Alex on either side. Cliff sat with me in front. Before we left, the landlord passed my wallet through the window. It had slimmed down to the point of emaciation, and it occurred to me that my bank manager, who was always advising me in the kindest possible way to watch my overdraft, would be tossing uneasily in his bed if he knew. I drove through the sleeping town and turned down the narrow road towards the marketplace. As we approached, I could see that the cobbled square was deserted except for 2 figures standing at the edge of the roadway under a streetlight. With a twinge of alarm, I recognised Inspector Bowles and Sergeant Rostron, our 2 head policemen. They were standing very erect and trim-looking, hands behind their backs, glancing around them keenly. They looked as though they wouldn't miss any misdemeanours in their vicinity. A sudden scream from the back seat almost sent me through a shop window. Hubert had seen them too. "It's that bugger Rostron!" he yelled. "I hate that bugger! He's had it in for me for years, and I'm going to tell him what I think about him!" There was a thrashing of arms in the back as he wound down the window and started his tirade at the top of his voice. "You bloody rotten—" For the second time that night, an icy dread swept over me that something awful was going to happen because of me. "Quell him!" I shouted. "For God's sake, quell him!" However, my friends in the rear had anticipated me. Hubert's cries were suddenly switched off as Tristan and Alex bundled him to the floor and fell on top of him. Tristan was actually sitting on his head when we came up to the 2 policemen, and only muffled sounds drifted from below. As we passed, the inspector nodded and smiled, and the sergeant gave me a friendly salute. It was not difficult to read their minds as they docketed away another item of information. "Mr. Herriot, returning from yet another night call. A dedicated vet, that young man." With their colleague riding on the floor behind me, I could not relax until we had turned off the square out of sight and sound. Hubert, when allowed to get up, seemed to have lost a lot of his belligerence. In fact, he was reaching the sleepy stage, and when he reached his home, he walked quietly and fairly steadily up his garden path. Back in Skeldale House, I went up to our bedroom. The big room with the double bed, wardrobe and dressing table was eerily empty without Helen. I opened the door to the long, narrow apartment which had been the dressing room in the great days of the old house. It was where Tristan slept when we were all bachelors together, but now it was Jimmy's room, and his bed stood in exactly the same place as my old friend's. I looked down on my son as I had often looked down on Tristan in his slumbers. I used to marvel at Tristan's cherubic innocence, but even he could not compete with a sleeping child. I gazed at little Jimmy, then glanced at the other end of the room where a cot stood ready to receive Rosie. Soon, I thought, I would have two in here. I was becoming rich. Chapter 18. November the 2nd, 1961. We learnt in the morning that we would not start unloading the sheep until evening, as the Ubergen was still occupying the berth, so this gave me plenty of opportunity to explore the town. Shortly after breakfast, an important person came aboard, the head director of Inflot, which deals with the movement of all ships in the harbour. He was a kindly-looking man of about 50 with an attractive smile. He wore very thick glasses, and he told me that his weak eyesight had been caused by hours of studying at night. His English was very good. Maybe it was because he was so pleasant that I was emboldened to broach the question of the school. Another reason, of course, was that I was somewhat puffed up by my own importance. When I was recently elected chairman of the Darrowby Parent Teachers Association, it gave my ego a definite boost, and when our headmaster expressed an interest in Russian education, he started an idea in my mind. Anyway, whatever the cause, I was about to do another of my daft things. "Do you think I could possibly see inside a Russian school?" I asked him. The eyes behind the glasses stopped twinkling, and he gave me a long, thoughtful stare. After a few moments, he nodded.
"I think it will be all right if you ask permission when you go to the school. As it happens, my wife is a teacher, and if you go to Scholar number 2, you could ask for Madame Yevskaya."
I could hardly wait to get ashore, but again I couldn't find any volunteers to come with me. When I finally approached the captain, he probably felt like throwing me over the side. He was short of sleep after our stormy voyage, and weary with his long negotiations with the officials, but still had the goodness to humour me. He smiled and said, "Of course, Mr. Herriot." As he settled his peaked hat on his silvery head and pulled on a smart navy blue coat, I thought how very distinguished he looked. Down the gangway again, past the unsmiling soldiers and along the railway tracks towards the gate. But I just had to solve the mystery of the man-eating dog. As we passed the wagon of last night, I caught the captain's arm. "Just a minute," I said. "I want to have a peep behind here." For a moment he lost his poise and his eyes widened. "Mr. Herriot, no. What are you doing?" "It's all right," I smiled reassuringly. "I only want a quick look." With the greatest care, I edged my way behind the wagon. But the dog was gone. There was only an empty kennel. Then I noticed that there was a kennel about every 50 yards, and a chain attached by a ring to a wire which stretched along the entire length of the fence. As I re-emerged, to the obvious relief of the captain, I saw in the distance groups of dogs being led towards us. We passed them on the way to the gatehouse, large, stringy creatures loping along at the end of their leads, looking neither to the right or left. They were of Alsatian type, but taller, and they certainly had a lean and hungry look. I looked around at the soldiers by the water's edge, and in the watchtowers, and back again at the dogs. Best of luck, I thought, to anybody who tried to get in or out of here after dark. As we walked along, loudspeakers blared at us from all directions. This went on all the time the ship was in Clydida, but it was not music, but talking. Talk, 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 all day. I do not know if it was political indoctrination or news of Soviet achievements, but it went on without stopping, and I was very tired of it. Once outside the harbour, we began to make our way through the streets. Clydida is a town of 100,000 inhabitants, and we headed for what we thought was the centre of the place. The streets on the outskirts were simply packed down earth, and this applied also to the footpaths. Great muddy puddles stood everywhere, and there were holes, sometimes 3 or 4 feet deep, which had been dug in the footpaths and apparently just left with the heap of soil beside them. Apart from the tenements, there were the old Lithuanian houses, and these were in a very poor state of repair, with the paint flaking and the roof tiles loose or missing. Many of the houses had little balconies in front of the upper windows. There were quite a few people about, picking their way over the reddish clay. We walked until we reached the main street, Monty's Street. This had a cobbled surface and proper pavements, and there were shops on either side. The bookshops seemed to sell only technical literature. There was a store full of bicycles, scooters and mopeds, and a sports shop with roller skates, of a different type from ours, fencing foils and table tennis sets in the window. One shop was apparently devoted entirely to chessmen and chessboards. We saw what looked like one of our licensed grocers, with lots of tinned and bottled goods and bottles of wine on show. But the place which really intrigued me was the fish shop. Its window was filled with large imitation fish of all colours. These models were covered with dust, and were enough to put one off fish for life. Inside I could see a high counter with white enamel bowls filled with the real things. A characteristic of all the shops was their general dinginess. The windows were all dirty and unwashed, and there was no attempt to display their wares attractively. There was very little traffic, mainly commercial vehicles with an occasional private car or taxi. There were a lot of people in the town centre, most of the women in headscarves and undistinguished clothes. It occurred to me that I had not seen a single smartly dressed woman since my arrival. In fact, women seemed to do a lot of the rough jobs. Back in the harbour, women, dressed in cloaks and hoods, operated some of the mighty cranes which served the ships. I noticed, too, on a building site, a group of girls throwing bricks from one to another, as our bricklayers do. Their hands must have been hard and rough. A column of youngsters marched by, led by a tall man, probably a teacher. They were laughing and singing and looked very like English children, except that many of the boys had peaked army-style caps, and the little girls, without exception, wore long brown woolen stockings of the sort girls used to wear in our country in my early school days. All the children looked healthy and happy. I stopped a young man in the street and showed him the slip of paper with the name of the school written in Russian. Again there was the polite response. He went out of his way and led us to the door of the school. It was a large, old-fashioned type of building set flush on the roadside with no sign of a playground. It looked more like a big block of offices. The man from Inflot had told me to ask permission, but there didn't seem to be anybody about, so I did my second daft thing of the trip. I just barged inside, followed dutifully by the captain. Once through the door, there was something I noticed immediately. The intense silence, unusual in a school. We were in a long passage whose walls were hung with brightly coloured paintings of every conceivable sporting activity and of Russian feats of arms. These latter were done in a very romantic style. Soldiers with bandaged foreheads, bayonets outstretched, handsome faces gazing fearlessly ahead. There was a glass case containing diplomas and certificates. Many doors led off the passage, and I began to work my way along, knocking first, then trying the handle. They all seemed to be locked, and when I reached one near the end, I had given up hope. I turned the handle without knocking, and it flew open. I almost fell into a big room with a lot of startled women looking at me. They were all seated around a long table, and at the top was a big, impressive man with craggy features. He was staring at me harder than any of them. I was obviously in the staff room, and I realized that I must have presented a strange sight. I had brought only my working clothes with me on the voyage, and was clad in the black plastic mackintosh which I wore round the farms. This coat was frayed at cuffs and collar, and tattered by many horn thrusts. When horns tore off buttons and ripped pockets, I didn't like to pass it on to Helen to repair, because despite my efforts to keep it clean, it carried the powerful odour of the farmyard deep in its seams. So I always did the sewing myself, using the thick bright blue nylon with which I stitched cows' wounds. This, with the ends of the coloured threads hanging loose, gave the garment an even more bizarre appearance. They all continued to stare, but the man at the head of the table had clearly seen enough. He rose from his chair and hurried through a door at the far end. It didn't need a lot of intuition to know that he had gone to the telephone. A realization of my imprudence was dawning on me, but I swallowed a lump in my throat, gave what I hoped was a winning smile, and said, "Madame Yevskaya?" One of the women nodded. The others looked at her questioningly, and she turned deathly pale. She must have thought I was somebody sinister, because she was undoubtedly frightened. The captain could see it was time he took over. He stepped in front of me and addressed the company rapidly in German. He told them that I was chairman of the PTA in Darrowby, but this information, not surprisingly, evoked no gasps of awe. I stood there, the centre of all those female eyes. They were a very attractive lot of young women, for all the world like teachers in Britain, except for one dark-skinned Mongolian miss. but it was easy to see that they were not similarly impressed with me. The captain, a man of infinite resource, came to the rescue again and asked which one was the English teacher. The prettiest of them all came forward, and I was just about to speak to her when the door behind me burst open and 2 Russian army officers marched in. They were massive men, very smart in their high-shouldered uniforms, epaulettes with stars, breeches and shiny high boots. They began to speak rapidly with the man who had returned to the top of the table, glaring over at me every few seconds. The man was wide-eyed, throwing his arms around, shaking his head, and I required no knowledge of Russian to divine that he was telling them that I had rushed in here from nowhere. He had no idea who the devil I was, and he didn't like the look of me one little bit. I do not wish to be overdramatic, but I am convinced that if Captain Rasmussen had not been with me, I would have been hustled off to the local jail. He, however, stepped in once more with a flurry of explanations in German. Another thing which saved me was that the little English teacher began to talk to me about the school. I sat down by her side at the table, and the officers moved close to me as we spoke together. All the time I was very conscious of their towering presence. They hung over me, looking me up and down, no doubt mystified by my eccentric apparel. On an inspiration, I asked the English teacher her name. It was a real jawbreaker, and I couldn't make much of it, but she said she was known as what sounded like Kitty. She told me she was married with a child of 6. She clapped her hands together. "Oh, I'm so excited," she said. "I have taught English for so long, but I have never spoken to a real Englishman before. You must tell me if my pronunciation is very bad." "You speak English better than I do," I replied. Kitty was delighted. She told me that the director of the school had taken all the 1,200 children away for the day on what was a regular visit to some local institution where they saw a film show and listened to talks. This accounted for the silence. The big man at the head of the table was the deputy director. As we swapped information, the other teachers pulled their chairs closer to us and listened with the greatest interest as Kitty passed everything on to them. Even the forbidding deputy director could not contain his curiosity and leant across the table, elbows on the wood, watching me intently. As the atmosphere grew more cordial, I was relieved to see the 2 officers move away and lean against the wall. Their previous hostile expressions were now merely impassive. A hectic question-and-answer session now ensued, with Kitty relaying my words round the table. "At what age do your children start school?" she asked. When I replied, at 4 or 5 years old, it caused general amazement. "Ours do not start till 7 or 8 years old," she said, and I was similarly surprised. The deputy director got quite heated on this point. He banged his hand on the table and declared that according to the principles of education, it was impossible to teach children of 5. What could they possibly learn, he wanted to know. When I told him they learned simple sums and words to start with, he shook his head vigorously in disbelief. All the teachers were astonished, too, to hear about the normal school hours in Britain. Kitty told me that Russian younger children go from 8:30 a.m. till 2:30 p.m., and the 5th and 6th formers go from 2:30 p.m. till 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. at night. Their classes average about 30 in number, and they teach all the mathematical subjects, physics, chemistry, biology, geography, and Russian history. The principal foreign language at that school was English, then German and Lithuanian. French and Latin were not taught. I had to get in a question about sport. "Do you have games in your curriculum?" Kitty raised her hands and laughed. "Many, many games. Volleyball is the most popular, but there is swimming, hockey, skating, football, PE, and gymnastics. Also," she went on, "we have many school clubs and outside activities. Do you have pioneers in your country?" I presumed that this meant camping and hiking. I said yes, we did this too in our schools, and I launched into an explanation of the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme. I struck an unexpected snag here because none of them had even heard of the Duke of Edinburgh. I laughed. "Oh, surely you must know him. Our Queen's husband." Blank faces and shrugs all round. "Edinburgh? Edinburgh?" Kitty queried. "Yes, of course," I replied, "the capital of Scotland." "But Dublin is the capital of Scotland," she said. So I decided to drop that topic. Just about then, the army officers, seeing the teachers grouped around me, laughing and talking animatedly, apparently decided I was harmless and left the room. The atmosphere, which had thawed remarkably, became still more cordial, and the questioning went on at top speed. "Do you teach religion?" I asked. Of course, I knew very well that they didn't, but I was interested to see what they would say. Their reaction was pretty uniform, a kind of pitying amusement. One big, dark girl, smiling sarcastically, put a question through Kitty. "Do you teach about Darwin, too?" I nodded. "Yes, we teach religion, and also about evolution and the scientific explanations of the beginnings of the world and of man." This caused general puzzlement. We discussed their attitude to religion, and I gathered that it was regarded as a private thing, and people could go to church if they wished. It was not banned, nor was there any propaganda against it in the schools. The teachers seemed to be of the opinion that it would just quietly die out. There were 3 churches in Clydesdale, but in some towns of a similar size there were many more. The teachers commiserated with me on the tremendous unemployment and poverty in Britain, and I got the impression that they thought I came from a land of starvation and soup kitchens. When I told them that British workers enjoyed a steady improvement in their living standards and that many of them owned cars, they looked at me with frank incredulity. Obviously they thought I was purveying capitalist propaganda. And in one way I couldn't blame them. I could see their eyes flickering over my ragged coat with the torn-down pockets and the buttons with their blue garlands. If this was a British professional man, what were the ordinary workers like? "But your teachers do not have our standard of living," one of them declared. I wondered if she had a point. These women were all beautifully dressed and clearly prosperous. I had the feeling that the teacher is a very prestigious person in Russia. "What is the 11+ examination?" was the next question. I tried to explain it as well as I could, but they really grilled me on this. The deputy director burst in, his deep-chested voice booming like an organ note amid the female chatter.
There is absolutely no point in grading children according to ability as you describe.
He was clearly a man of immovable opinions. I looked across at him. "Well, do you have all grades in one class?" The answer came back through Kitty. "All Russian children are clever." This was said with complete conviction, and quite seriously. In the ensuing discussions, I gathered that a very high proportion of the pupils go on to universities and that further education in the form of night schools is very popular. In fact, many Russians obtain a complete education up to university standard by working in these night schools. "How about school meals?" I asked. "Oh, yes," Kitty replied. "All the children stay for meals." She mentioned the number of kopecks they paid each day, and it worked out at about 1 shilling per meal. "For this," Kitty went on, "they get a glass of tea, bread, and sausage." This did not sound as substantial as the food in English schools. A volley of Russian from the deputy director was translated as an attack on the private school system in Britain. In the course of my reply, I mentioned that the private schools were called public schools, which made them all look blank. The big man kept hammering home his point, that only the children of the rich got a proper education in Britain. But when I pointed out that through university grants, everybody in our country could receive a full education no matter what their financial position, he narrowed his eyes suspiciously. I don't think he believed me. However, the party was really going with a bang, with lots of laughter, banter, and give and take. It was a pity in one way that the children were away, but on the other hand, I should never have had this priceless opportunity to have a long discussion with all the teachers. I was enjoying it so much that I could have stayed all day, but I saw the captain glancing anxiously at his watch and knew he was worried about getting back to the ship. Poor chap. He must have been praying that he would never have to sail with another veterinary attendant like me. We took our leave in the friendliest spirit, with laughter and handshakes all round. Little Kitty was particularly nice. "Oh, I'm so thrilled. I will always remember meeting a real, live Englishman," she said as we parted. The deputy director also revealed an unexpected vein of massive charm as he led us out formally to the main door. His powerful features relaxed into a pleasant smile as he shook hands, bowed, and waved us off down the street. As we left the school, I saw some of the children coming back. They were all boys, about 12 years old, and many had a greenish military-style uniform and peaked cap. I saw one with a stripe on his arm. Whether this was a school uniform or whether they were members of a cadet corps, I do not know. Back at the ship, trouble awaited me. A woman who I was told was a farm commissar had been asking to see me. She was huge, well over 6 feet and broad in proportion, and as she towered over me, 2 hard eyes and a rough-hewn countenance regarded me coldly from under a black beret. She obviously meant business. She spoke no English, but came to the point straight away. The other Russians had simulated the sheep's cough very closely, but this, rumbling from deep in her mighty ribcage, was the best effort yet. I tried my shrug and vacant smile, but it didn't work with this one. She seized my arm in steel claws and propelled me effortlessly towards the hold. Down there among the sheep, she pointed an accusing finger at the Lincolns and went through the coughing routine again and again, while I replied with a series of reassuring grins which became more and more exhausting. She produced a thermometer, and I wondered if she was a vet. If so, I greatly preferred her chubby little colleague of the morning. She needed no assistance to hold the sheep, but jammed a great knee against each animal, trapping them against the wall as though they were puppy dogs. All the readings were normal, and she grew more and more impatient. As she charged around the pen, she made frequent contact with me. I am a fairly solidly built man of around 5'10", but she never even noticed as I bounced off her, and the thought occurred to me that if we both donned boxing gloves and got into a ring together, I would be lucky to last a 3-minute round. Finally, she produced a tiny Russian-English dictionary and tried me out with various incomprehensible words. The nearest she came to the root of the matter was bronchitis, but by then she had lapsed into a discontented muttering. I had the feeling that she was no longer aware of my presence, so I took my opportunity and made a bolt for my cabin. I was almost there when Nielsen's head poked out from his cooking cell. "You missed your lunch, Mr. Herriot. You have tough time, you look tired. Wait here." He held up a hand. "I make you something." I stood in the doorway as he laid out a slice of rye bread and began to chop onto it tiny pieces of raw steak. He slashed away like lightning, his huge knife glinting with the expert movements. Then he began to whittle away at a raw onion till the meat was covered with the fragments, and followed this by cracking an egg on the top of the pile. He finished by dusting the whole mound with salt and black pepper before holding the final result proudly in my direction. "Beef tartare?" His voice had a triumphant ring. "You eat, Mr. Herriot? You feel better?" I shrank back a pace. How could I possibly eat this concoction? Raw meat, uncooked egg, it was unthinkable. I was desperately scouring my mind for some excuse to decline when I looked up again at Nielsen's beaming face. He was my friend, this unsung genius of the galley, and he was trying to succour me in my time of need. I would undoubtedly be ill later, but I couldn't say no. It took courage, but I thanked him, seized the heaped slice of bread, and bit resolutely into it. I thought if I held my breath throughout, I wouldn't taste anything, but there was too much of it, and as I exhaled, I got the full flavour. It was delicious. The cook's expression became more and more ecstatic as he saw the growing wonder in my face. Then, as I chewed steadily, he must have noticed a fleeting doubt, a moment of disbelief in my eyes, because he rested a hand anxiously on my shoulder. "A little more pepper, maybe?" I swallowed and regarded him for a moment. "Well, yes, possibly. Just a touch." He plied the grater, and as I started again on the delicacy, he began to pour me a glass of lager, his face a picture of delight. I was sorry when I came to the end of the beef tartare, but the strong Carlsberg was just right to wash it down. Nielsen's taste was impeccable as always. It was dark, about 8 p.m, when the Ubergen moved out. Our ship took its place, and the discharging of the cargo commenced. Wagons drew up on the railway lines alongside the ship. A great crane lowered a gangway, and my poor little sheep were driven up the ramps. I had literally lived with them for 6 days, and even though I knew that as pedigree-breeding animals they would get the best of treatment, it tugged at my heart to see them go. Those beautiful Romney marshes with their teddy bear heads, trotting under the glaring lights and disappearing into the black interiors of the wagons. I didn't like it at all. They had come from the green fields of Kent, and as the doors closed behind them, I wondered where they were going. A throng of black-capped Russian workers swarmed on the quayside, wheeling the wagons from the darkness into the light thrown by the cranes. They all looked frail, dark, and washed out in contrast with the strapping Danes on the ship. My faithful helper, Round, was in the thick of the action, all 6'4" of him, his mop of golden hair flapping as he ushered the animals along the ramp. Another striking figure was Jumbo, the youngest seaman on the ship. Apparently, the youngest member of the crew is always called Jumbo, pronounced Jumbo, and this chap was just about the bonniest lad I've ever seen. 17 years old, immensely tall and with massive shoulders, yet he had an angelic face with large blue eyes and thick yellow hair growing down over his ears. His job was the unloading of the surplus fodder, and I marvelled at the effortless way he roped and hoisted the heavy bags and bales onto the hook, which swung down again and again from the crane on the quay. I couldn't help thinking of the Vikings. If these men were typical, the Danes are a wonderful race. Finally, at about midnight, the last sheep had trotted from sight, and the last bale of hay and bag of nuts had been lifted out. The man in charge of the Russian workers waved up at me as I looked down from the rail of the ship. "Doctor, goodbye," he cried, and went off into the night. I walked around the empty holds, feeling a sense of loss. Then I went up to the captain's cabin to await a representative from Safrat to sign my acceptance forms. He came at about 2 a.m., that is 4 a.m. Russian time. He was a young chap of about 25, and he had been hard at it all day, checking the sheep and supervising the unloading. He was exhausted, white-faced and grimy, and I noticed that his nails were bitten right back. But he was no fool. He could speak and write English very well, and he had the authority to sign for £20,000 worth of sheep. On the first form he wrote, "About 20% of Lincoln sheeps have cough." Gently I pointed out that it should be sheep, and though he was so tired that he could hardly keep his eyes open, he launched into an interrogation as to why the singular should be the same as the plural, and wanted to know all the other English words which had this peculiarity. It was another symptom of the passion for learning that I had found repeatedly in Clydida. He was followed by the customs and immigration people who cleared our passports. Then the Inflot representatives came aboard and presented their bills to the captain. So many rubles for pilot, berthing, etc. The captain gave them hell in his gentlemanly way and said they charged far too much, but they only shrugged their shoulders and laughed heartily. The very last Russian to come aboard was the pilot, a different one this time. His face was grave as he spoke to the captain. "There is big storm blowing out beyond the estuary. Force 6 to 8 and getting worse. I advise you to pull away from the berth and anchor in the harbour till morning." He wagged a finger as he made his final admonition. "It will not be so good out there for you tonight." The captain paced up and down the cabin, trying to make up his mind. He badly wanted to be off, but dared he risk the storm? At last he said, "I think you are right, Mr. Pilot. We had better stay here tonight." Leaving the cabin, I bumped into the mate. He had overheard the conversation, and he looked at me ruefully. "I tell you this, Mr. Herriot. I have heard this before. We will leave tonight. Captain Rasmussen, he is not afraid of storms. Prepare yourself." Sitting over my log, I became very sleepy, and my bunk looked very inviting. Still and peaceful, it beckoned to me. It had been a long, long day. Chapter 19. "This is Biggins here." I gripped the telephone tightly and dug the nails of my other hand into my palm. Mr. Biggins' vacillations always tried me sorely. He regarded calling out the vet as a final, desperate measure, and it was always sheer torture for him to make up his mind to take it. On top of that, he was extremely pig-headed about taking my advice if I did manage to fight my way onto his farm, and I knew beyond doubt that I'd never ever managed to please him. He had made me suffer during my pre-RAF days. And now, with the war over, he was still there, a bit older and a bit more pig-headed. "What's the trouble, Mr. Biggins?"
Well, I have a heifer badly.
"Right. I'll have a look at her this morning."
Hold on just a minute.
Mr. Biggins was still not sure if he wanted me out there, even though he had gone as far as lifting the phone.
Are you sure she needs seeing?
"Well, I don't know. What's she doing?" There was a long pause.
Just laid out like.
"Laid out?" I said. "That sounds rather serious to me. I'll be along as soon as possible. Now then, she hasn't always been laid out." "Well, how long then?"
Just this last couple of days.
"You mean she just dropped down?"
Nay.
His voice took on an edge of exasperation at my thick-headedness.
She's been off her grub for a week, and now she's gone down.
I took a long breath. "So she's been ill for a week, and now she's collapsed, and you've decided to call me?"
Aye, that's right. She were pretty bright about head till she went off her legs.
"Right, Mr. Biggins. I'll be with you very soon."
Aye, but... Are you sure there's any need?
I put down the receiver. I knew from hard experience that this conversation could go on for a long time. I also knew that I was probably visiting a hopeless case, but if I got there immediately, I might be able to do something. I was on the farm within 10 minutes, and Mr. Biggins met me with his typical attitude. Hands in pockets, shoulders hunched, eyes regarding me suspiciously from under a thick fringe of greying eyebrows.
"You're hour late,"
he grunted. I stopped with one foot out of the car. "You mean she's dead?"
"Nay, but just about. You're too late to do out about it now."
I gritted my teeth. This animal had been ill for a week. I had arrived 10 minutes after being summoned, but the farmer's tone was unequivocal. If it died, it would be my fault. I had come hour late. "Ah, well," I said, trying to relax, "if she's dying, there's nothing I can do." I began to get back into the car. Mr. Biggins lowered his head and kicked at a cobblestone with a massive boot.
"Are you not going to look at her while you're here?"
"I thought you said it was too late."
Aye, but you're the veterinary."
"Right, if that's what you want." I climbed out again. "Where is she?" He hesitated.
"Will you charge me extra?"
"No, I won't. I've made the journey to your farm, and if I can't do anything more, that's all you'll pay for." It was a sadly familiar sight. The skinny young beast lying in a dark corner of the fold yard, eyes sunken and glazed and moving every few seconds with the slow nystagmus of approaching death. Temperature was 99 degrees Fahrenheit. "Yes, you're right, Mr. Biggins," I said. "She's dying." I put my thermometer away and began to leave. The farmer was a picture of gloom with his head sunk deep in his shoulders as he looked down at the beast. Then he glanced at me quickly.
"Where you going?"
I looked back in surprise. "I'm going on my round. I'm truly sorry about your heifer, Mr. Biggins, but she's beyond human aid."
"So you're just going to walk away without doing out?"
He gave me a truculent stare. "But she's dying. You said so yourself."
"Aye, but you're vet, not me. And I've always heard that where there's life, there's hope."
"Not in this case, I assure you. She could go any minute." He continued to stare down at the animal.
"Look, she's breathing, isn't she? Aren't you going to give her a chance?"
"Well, if you like, I can try giving her a stimulant injection into her vein."
"It's not what I like. You're one that's supposed to know."
"Very well, I'll have a go." I trailed out to the car for the injection. The heifer, in a deep coma, knew nothing as I slipped the needle into the jugular vein. As I depressed the plunger, Mr. Biggins gave tongue again.
"Expensive thing, them injections. How much is this going to cost me, then?"
"I honestly don't know." My mind was beginning to reel.
"You'll know all right when you get pen in your hand to send me that big bill, won't you?"
I didn't answer. As the last drop of fluid trickled into the vein, the heifer extended her forelimbs, stared sightlessly ahead for a second, then stopped breathing. I watched her for a few moments, then put my hand over her heart. "I'm afraid she's dead, Mr. Biggins." He bent quickly.
"Have you killed her?"
No, of course not." She was just ready to go. The farmer rubbed his chin.
It wasn't much of a bloody stimulant, was it?
I had no answer to that one, and began to put my syringe away. I was conscious of an increasing desire to get off this farm as quickly as possible. I was on the way to the car when Mr. Biggins caught at my arm.
Well, what was the matter with her?
I don't know.
You don't know? Well, you've wasted my money with that injection. Vets are supposed to know, aren't they?
Yes, Mr. Biggins, they are, but in this case I could only say that the animal was dying. You would need a post-mortem examination to find out the cause of death. The farmer began to pluck excitedly at his coat.
Well, this is a funny carry-on. I have a dead beast here, and nobody knows what killed it. Could be anything, couldn't it?
Well, I suppose so.
Could be anthrax.
Oh, no, Mr. Biggins. Anthrax is very sudden, and you say this heifer was ill for over a week.
Nay, not right ill. Just a bit off it. Then she went down like a shot at 10. That was sudden enough.
Oh, but...
And Fred Bramley at Long Road had a beast with anthrax last month, didn't he?
Yes, that's right. There was a positive case there, first around here for several years. But that was in a cow he found dead.
I don't care.
Mr. Biggins stuck his jaw out.
The Darrowby and Hulton Times was on about it, and they said that all sudden deaths should be examined for anthrax because it was right dangerous and fatal to people. I want my heifer examined.
OK, I replied wearily, if you say so. As it happens, I have my microscope with me.
Microscope? That sounds a costly job. How much will that be?
That's all right. The ministry pays me, I said, and began to walk towards the house. Mr. Biggins nodded with glum satisfaction, then raised his eyebrows.
Where are you going now?
Into the house. I've got to use your phone to report to the ministry. I can't do anything till I get permission. I'll pay for the call. I added the last few words because he was beginning to look worried. He stood by me as I spoke to the ministry clerk. He fidgeted impatiently when I asked him for his full name, the proper name of the farm, the breed of the heifer.
Didn't know I'd have to go through all this, he mumbled.
I went out and produced my post-mortem knife from the car boot. It was a large and dangerous carving knife which I used only on dead animals. Mr. Biggins' eyes widened at the sight of it.
By God, I don't like the look of that bloody great knife. What are you going to do with that?
Just take a bit of blood. I bent and made a quick nick at the root of the heifer's tail and smeared a film of blood onto a glass slide. I took this, along with the microscope, into the farmhouse kitchen. "Now what do you want?" Mr. Biggins asked sourly. I looked around. "I want the use of the sink, the fire, and that table by the window." The sink was full of dirty dishes, which the farmer removed with groans of protest, while I fixed the blood film by drawing it through the flames in the hearth. Then I moved to the sink and poured methylene blue over the slide. In the process, a small blue pool formed in the white sink bottom, and the coloration stayed there after I'd swilled the side with cold water from the tap.
"Look at the bloody mess you've made!" Mr. Biggins exclaimed. "You've stained the sink. The missus will play hell when she gets home this afternoon."
I forced a smile. "Don't worry, that isn't a stain. It will come off quite easily." But I could see he didn't believe me. I dried the slide off at the fire, rigged up the microscope on the table, and peered through the eyepiece. As I expected, I found only the usual pattern of red and white corpuscles. Not an anthrax bacillus in sight. "Well, there's nothing there," I said. "You can call the knacker man quite safely." Mr. Biggins blew out his cheeks and made a long, suffering gesture with one hand.
"All that bloody fuss for nothing," he sighed.
As I drove away, I felt, not for the first time, that you just couldn't win with Mr. Biggins, and a month later the conviction was strengthened when he came into the surgery one market day.
"One of me cows has wooden tongue," he announced. "I want some iodine to paint on."
Siegfried looked up from the daybook where he was checking the visits.
"Oh, you're a bit out of date, Mr. Biggins," he said, smiling. "We've got a far better medicine than that now."
The farmer took up his usual stance, head down, glowering under his eyebrows.
"I don't care about your new medicine. I want the stuff I allus used."
But Mr. Biggins, Siegfried, was at his most reasonable. Painting the tongue with iodine went out years ago. Since then, we've used intravenous injections of sodium iodide, which was much better. But now even that has been replaced by sulfanilamide.
Big words, Mr. Farnan, big fancy words, grunted the farmer. But I know what's best for me cow, so are you going to give me the iodine or not?
No, I am not, Siegfried replied, the smile fading from his face. I wouldn't be a competent veterinary surgeon if I prescribed something as totally outdated as that. He turned to me.
James, would you slip through to the stockroom and bring a pound packet of the sulfanilamide?
Mr. Biggins was protesting as I hurried from the office. In the stockroom, the sulfanilamide packets stood in rows. Some pounds, other half-pounds. But there were plenty of them because at that time this drug bulked very large in our veterinary life. It was such a striking improvement on our old remedies. It was useful in many kinds of bacterial diseases. It was an excellent dusting powder for wounds. And, of course, as Siegfried had said, it cleared up actinobacillosis, or wooden tongue, quite rapidly. The packets were square and wrapped in white paper tied down with string. I grabbed one from the shelf and returned at a trot, listening to the two voices echoing along the passage. The argument was still raging when I came back to the office, and I could see that Siegfried's patience was running out. He seized a packet from me and began to write the instructions on the label. You give 3 tablespoons in a pint of water to start with, then...
But I tell you, I don't want...
You follow with 1 tablespoon 3 times daily.
Got no faith in them new things.
And after you've used the packet, let us know, and we'll give you another supply if necessary. The farmer glared at my partner.
This stuff'll do no good.
Mr. Biggins, Siegfried said with ominous calm, it will cure your cow.
It won't.
It will.
It won't!
Siegfried brought his hand down on the desk with a thud. Clearly he had had enough. Take this, and if it doesn't do the trick, I won't charge you. All right? Mr. Biggins narrowed his eyes, but I could see that the idea of something for nothing had an irresistible appeal. Slowly, he stretched out his hand and took the sulfanilamide. Splendid! Siegfried jumped up and patted the farmer's shoulder. Now you get in touch with us when you've used it. I bet you anything your cow will soon be much better. It would be about 10 days after this interview that Siegfried and I were out together castrating colts, and on the way back to the surgery we had to pass through Mr. Biggins' village. Siegfried slowed down when he saw the farmhouse. It was square-faced and massive, and the front garden showed only the sprouting heads of potato plants. Mr. Biggins did not believe in wasting money on ornamentation. "Tell you what, James," my partner murmured, "we'll just drop in there. We haven't heard from our old friend about the sulfanilamide. Doesn't want to lose face, I suspect." He laughed softly. "We'll be able to rub it in a bit." He turned the wheel and drove round to the yard at the back of the house. Outside the kitchen door, Siegfried raised his hand to knock, then he gripped my arm. "Look at that, James," he said in an urgent whisper. He pointed to the kitchen window, and there on the sill was our square white packet. Virgin and unopened, the string binding undisturbed. My partner clenched his fist. The cussed old blighter. He won't try it, out of sheer spite. At that moment the farmer opened the door and Siegfried greeted him cheerfully. "Ah, good morning to you, Mr. Biggins. We were just passing and thought we'd check on how your cow was progressing." The eyes under the shaggy brows registered sudden alarm, but my partner held up a reassuring hand. "No charge, I give you my word. This is just for our own interest." But I've got my slippers on. Was just having a cup of tea. There's no need for you to, But Siegfried was already striding towards the cow buyer. The patient was easy to pick out. Her skin was stretched tightly over the jutting ribs and pelvic bones. Saliva drooled from her lips, and a long swelling bulged from under her jaw. She was a scarecrow among her sleek neighbours. Siegfried moved quickly to her head, seized the nose, and pulled it towards him. With his other hand he prized open the mouth and fingered the tongue. Feel that, James, he said softly. I ran my hand over the knobbly hard surface which for centuries had given actinobacillosis its evocative name. This is awful. It's a wonder she can eat at all. I sniffed at my fingers. And there's iodine here. Siegfried nodded. Yes, he's been to the chemist, despite what I said. At that moment, the bar door burst open and Mr. Biggins hurried in, panting slightly. My partner looked at him sadly along the cow's back. Well, it seems you're right. Our medicine hasn't done a bit of good. I can't understand it. He rubbed his chin. And your poor cow is a mess, I'm afraid. Almost starving to death. I do apologize. The farmer's face was a study. Aye, well, that's right. She's done no good. I reckon she'll... Siegfried broke in. Look here, he said, I feel responsible for this. My medicine has failed. So, it's up to me to get her right. He strode from between the cows. I have an injection in the car which I think will do the trick. Excuse me for a moment. Now then, wait a minute. I don't know... But the farmer's words went unheeded as my colleague hurried out to the yard. He was back very quickly, holding a bottle which I couldn't recognize. He held it up and began to fill a 20cc syringe, watching the rising level intently and whistling tunelessly under his breath. "Hold the tail, will you, James?" he said, and poised the needle over the cow's rump. With his hand still held high, he looked across at Mr. Biggins. "This is an excellent injection, but it's a good job you've been using our medicine." "Why's that?" "Well, on its own, it could have serious effects on the animal." "You mean... could kill her?" "Just possible," Siegfried murmured. "But you've nothing to worry about. She's had the sulfanilamide." He was about to plunge the needle in when the farmer gave tongue. Hey, hold on. Don't do that." "What is it, Mr. Biggins? Something wrong?" Nay, but there's maybe been a bit of a misunderstanding." Conflicting emotions chased across the farmer's face. "You see, it's like this. I don't think she's been getting enough of your stuff." Siegfried lowered his arm. "You mean you've been underdosing?" "I wrote the instructions on the packet, if you remember." "That's right. But I must have got a bit mixed up." "Oh, that doesn't matter. As long as you put her back to full dosage, all will be well." Siegfried inserted the needle, and ignoring Mr. Biggins' yelp of alarm, he injected the full contents. As he put the syringe back in its case, he sighed with satisfaction. "Well, I'm sure that will put everything right. But remember, you must start again with the full 3 tablespoons and continue till you've finished the packet. The cow is in such a state that I'm pretty sure you'll need a further supply, but you'll let us know about that, eh?" As we drove away, I stared at my colleague. What the devil was that injection? "Oh, mixed vitamins. It'll help the poor thing's condition, but it had nothing to do with the wooden tongue. Just part of my plan." He smiled gleefully. "Now he's got to use the sulfanilamide. It will be interesting to see what happens." It was indeed interesting. Within a week, Mr. Biggins was back in the surgery looking sheepish. "Can I have a bit more of that stuff?" he muttered. "By all means." Siegfried extended his arm in an expansive gesture. "As much as you like." He leant on the desk. "I suppose the cow is looking better?" "Aye." "Stopped slavering?" "Aye." "Putting on flesh, is she?" Aye, she is." Mr. Biggins lowered his head as though he didn't want to answer any more questions. Siegfried gave him another packet. Through the surgery window, we watched him cross the street, and my partner thumped me on the shoulder. "Well, James, that was a little victory. I think we've managed to beat Mr. Biggins." I laughed too, because it was very sweet. But when I look back over the years, I realise it was the only time we did beat him. Chapter 20. There is nothing very exciting about tuberculin testing, and I was quite pleased when George Forsyth, the insurance agent, came into the bar and started to make conversation. I was doing the annual test on the little farm of the Hudson brothers. Clem, the elder, about 40 years old, was painstakingly writing the numbers in the book, while Dick, a few years younger, was rubbing the inner surfaces of the ears to find the tattoo marks. As I clipped, measured and injected, I listened to George's observations on the weather, the latest cricket scores, and the price of pigs. He was leaning against the wall, taking leisurely pulls at a cigarette as though he had all the time in the world. But I had a fair idea he had come along for something more than idle talk. After a few minutes, he got round to the point.
"You know, Clem," he said, "you fellas should be properly insured."
Clem carefully rounded off a figure in the book.
"What are you talking about? We've got the car insured, and we're covered for fire and lightning. That's enough, isn't it?"
Enough? George was shocked.
"That's nothing. You should both have life policies for a start." "Nay, nay."
Clem shook his head.
"Don't believe in all that. In fact, I don't believe in insurance at all, except what you've got to have."
Dick raised his head from the front of the cow.
"And I don't believe in it either. You're wasting your time, George."
"Honestly," the agent said,
"You two are living in the past. Don't you think it would be a good thing for your dependents to have a nice sum of money in the event of your deaths?" "Not going to die for a long time yet," Clem grunted, moving along to the next cow.
"How the heck do you know that?"
"All the Hudsons is long-lived," Dick said. "They nearly have to shoot some of them. Our old dad's over 80 and he's fighting fit. He passed the farm over to us, but he could be working now if he wanted."
George tiptoed daintily to one side in his patent leather shoes as a cow raised her tail dangerously in his direction.
"You don't seem to get the point, but I won't press the matter. However," he raised a finger, "you should certainly have sickness policies."
Both the brothers had a good laugh at this.
"Sickness?"
Clem said, a pitying smile creasing his craggy features.
"Neither of us have ever ailed a thing in our lives. Never even had a cold. We haven't missed a day's work since we started on this place."
"But how do you know that's going to continue?" the agent replied weakly. "As you get older, you'll be more liable to illness."
"Oh, leave off, George."
Dick pushed his way out from between two cows.
"We've told you we don't believe in insurance, and that's all about it. And we're not going to chuck our money away on one of your fancy policies."
George narrowed his eyes. This was a challenge, and I could see he was going to rise to it.
"I'll tell you what,"
he began, but I had got to the end of the byre. "Where do we go now?" I asked. Clem pointed across the yard.
"Few heifers in a box over there."
They were big, rough beasts, and I pressed back against the wall as they careered around in the straw. The brothers had made a few ineffectual throws with a rope halter when I noticed George's head appearing over the box door.
"I tell you what," he repeated, and I was reminded of the old couplet. "There's no guy got endurance like the guy who sells insurance."
"How about an accident policy?"
"Both of you ought to have one."
Clem managed to snare one of the galloping animals and leant back on the rope.
"Accident? Fiddlesticks! We've never had an accident."
"Aha! That's the very reason why you should start protecting yourselves. The fact that nothing has happened to you makes it more probable that something is waiting round the corner. It's simple mathematics."
"There's naught simple about it," Dick said. "Just because we've never had an accident doesn't mean that—"
His words were cut off as the haltered beast went violently into reverse, and its bony rump thudded into his midriff, crushing him with brutal force against the rough stones of the wall. He sank down in the straw, completely winded, and sat motionless, holding his middle.
"Look at that!" George cried. "Just what I've been talking about. Yours is a dangerous trade. Anything could happen." "Aye, well, he's all right," Clem said doubtfully as his brother eased himself to his feet.
George's eyes had the fanatical gleam of an insurance man who suddenly finds fate on his side.
Yes, maybe he is all right this time, but he might have had an internal injury, mightn't he? Could have been off work for ages, and then where would you be? You'd have to pay for extra labour, wouldn't you? And with a nice little policy from me, you'd have the money to do it."
The musical sound of the word money appeared to stir something in Clem. He gave the agent a sidelong glance.
"How much?"
George became brisk and businesslike.
"Now then, I have just the thing for you here."
He pulled a sheaf of policies from his inside pocket.
"For a premium of £10 per annum, you would receive £20 a week in the case of incapacitated injuries. There are other benefits, of course. Look here."
Clem put on a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles and perused the document, while Dick looked over his shoulder. I could hear mutterings. £20 a week? Lot of money. Not bad. £20 was indeed a tidy sum in 1948, when the average weekly wage for a qualified veterinary assistant was around £10. Finally, Clem looked up. Reckon we might have a go at that. £20 a week will come in right handy. Splendid. Splendid! George produced a silver pencil. Just sign here, both of you. Thank you very much. He paused for a moment. And of course, there's young Herbert who works for you. Aye, he's down in Fields, Dick said. What about him? Well, you ought to have him covered too. But he's nobbut a lad. OK. George spread his hands. He goes in cheaper. £5 a year. Same benefits. The brothers' resistance seemed to have crumbled. All right. Suppose you might as well. We'll do him too. George tripped off to his car, whistling merrily, and we got on with the test. It was about 3 weeks later that I met Clem in Darrowby Marketplace. He was sauntering along, looking in the shop windows, and he was wearing a smart, dark suit, obviously not his working clothes. It was late afternoon, when he would normally have been bringing in his cows for milking, and I wondered at his presence in the town, until he turned round and I saw that his arm was in a sling. "What on earth have you been doing, Clem?" I asked. He looked down at the bulky white cast. "Broke me arm, slipped up on the cowhouse floor, and would you believe it?" His eyes widened. "It was nobbut 3 days after I'd signed that insurance form. I'm getting £20 a week, and the doctor reckons it'll be another 9 weeks before I can start work. That'll be more than £200 I'll have collected. All right, eh?" "It certainly is. What a blessing you took George Forsyth's advice. But you'll be paying for somebody to help you." "Nay, nay. We're managing grand as it is." He walked away, chuckling. Clem's injury had healed by the time I had to visit the Hudson farm again to cleanse a cow. Clem brought me a bucket of hot water, and I was soaping my arms when Dick came in. I should say he hobbled in, because he was on crutches. I stared at him, and an eerie sense of the workings of fate stirred in my mind. "Broken leg?" "Aye," Dick replied laconically. "Did it as easy as out. Tried to catch an owl ewe on top pasture, and upskittled myself in a rabbit hole." "You'll be out of action for a while, then?" "Aye. Plaster's got to stay on for 14 weeks. It's a bloody nuisance, but all them 20 quids is very nice. Good job we signed that paper." I didn't see him until he came into the surgery one market day to pay his veterinary bill. He had shed his cast, but was still limping slightly. "How is the leg, Dick?" I asked as I wrote in the receipt book. He grimaced. "Nobbut middling. Aches like hell sometimes, but I think it's getting stronger." "Ah, well." I handed him the receipted account. "You'll just have to take things a bit easier till you're back to normal." "Can't do that," he said, shaking his head. "We're short-handed as it is. Young Herbert had an accident." "What?" "Aye. Stuck a hay fork into his foot and got blood poisoning. He's well enough in himself, but doctor says it'll be a long time before he can walk about." In fact, it was 10 weeks before Herbert returned to work, but, as Clem confided to me over a beer when I encountered him one night in the Drovers' Arms, the £200 they collected from the insurance company had been something of a consolation. "Remarkable thing," I said. "George Forsyth must have been sent from heaven that morning. His company had been a tremendous help to you." Clem showed no enthusiasm, but stared gloomily into his glass. "But I'll tell thou someone. They're funny fellas, them insurance men. Would you believe it, after all that talking, they don't want us any more." "Really? How's that?" "Well, we got a letter from them saying, 'We do not wish to renew your insurance.' What do you make of that?" "Well, that sometimes happens, Clem," I said. Privately, I wasn't surprised. For an outlay of £30, the Hudsons had received more than £700 within a few months. I can imagine any company beating a hasty retreat. "Any road," he continued. "We've got another lot to take us on at the end of the year. We've shifted all our business to them. Farm, car, and lot." "And another accident policy, I suppose?" Clem tipped up his glass and took a long swallow. "Oh, aye." Then he turned to me with an injured expression. But they've made us pay an extra £1 each. It was some months later, shortly after the new company had shouldered the burden of the Hudson's insurance, that Dick fell into the bowels of the tractor. He could have been seriously injured, but sustained only a fracture of the thumb, which kept him off work for 8 weeks. He told me about it himself when he had recovered, and I was having a cup of tea in the farmhouse. "Another £160 in the kitty?" he said philosophically, pushing a plateful of homemade scones towards me. I must have looked bemused because he laughed. "And that's not all, Mr. Herriot. I had an accident with the car." "No." "Aye, I did. Ran into the side of young Bessie Trenholme's car and smashed me radiator and lights." "Well, that's almost unbelievable. And another claim, eh?" Dick gave a wry smile. "Well, now, I'll tell you. There's a bit of a story there. It was Bessie's fault, all right. She came out of the farm gate with no warning, but I'd only insured me car for third party, and I thought if it came to an argument, with only my word against hers, I'd have no chance, because she's a bonny young lass, is Bessie. So I decided not to claim, though I did mention it to the agent." "So nothing doing this time?" Dick's smile widened. "That's what I thought. But the agent came to see me a few days after and told me they'd made a mistake at his office. They'd insured me car comprehensive." "Good Lord. So you collected again?" "Aye. Another £150. Not bad." Dick cut a piece from a wedge of Wensleydale cheese, and his expression grew serious. "There's only one thing we're worried about. The agent acted a bit queer-like when he gave us the money. Didn't seem how pleased. We're just hoping this company isn't going to give us push like the last one." "Yes," I said, "I understand. That would be unfortunate." "It would be and all." Dick nodded gravely. "Clem and me's big believers in insurance." Chapter 21. November the 3rd, 1961. I crawled into my bunk at 3 a.m., and it seemed that I had hardly fallen asleep before I was awakened by the ship leaping and bucking like a wild thing. I looked out of the window at a vast stretch of wind-tossed ocean. Away in the distance, the lights of Clydida glimmered and faded. So, the mate had been right. Our captain was not to be deterred by a bit of bad weather. For the rest of the night, I remembered painfully the warnings I'd heard about coming home against the wind. On the way to Clydida, the main motion had been a sideways rolling, which I countered by jamming knees and elbows against the sides of the bunk. But this was a violent fore and aft movement, and it was 10 times worse. Over and over again I slid from one end of the bunk to the other, and there wasn't a thing I could do about it. From my weird changes of position, I could divine that the ship's bows were high in the air one moment and pointing right down the next. Outside, the gale howled, spray dashed against the windows, and the cabin furniture and my worldly goods flew around the place unchecked. I let them get on with it. Tidying up, I felt, would be a fruitless and dangerous business. Being thrown about constantly and listening to the medley of bangs and clatterings from all over the ship gave me small chance of sleep, and when dawn came I peered out at a dismal scene. I discovered then the reason for one of the new sounds I had heard during the night. Whereas the ship had slid down the sides of the huge waves with the wind behind it, it now fell keel first into each green chasm, and when this happened, there was a jarring crash as though we had hit a rock. It was like a diver doing a belly flop, and the effect was alarming. It seemed that after this terrible night, my friends on the ship had decided that I would be prostrate and helpless this morning, because instead of the mess boy calling me at 8 a.m., Nielsen himself knocked and spoke through the door. "You stay in bed, Mr. Herriot. I bring you a little breakfast." "No, thanks," I replied. "Come in." He opened the door and looked startled when he saw me trying to shave with my back jammed against one wall and my foot against another. "You okay?" he asked, disbelievingly. I seized upon a momentary pause in the ship's pitching to scrape another inch of soap from my face. "Yes, fine. What did you say about breakfast?" "Well, we have kippers, fried eggs, and some nice smoked sausage." "Sounds great. I'll be there in a few minutes." He gave me a final incredulous glance and left. When I entered the mess room, only the mate was present. He was working among the assorted foodstuffs, and he raised his eyebrows and paused, fork halfway to his mouth, when he saw me start enthusiastically on my piled plate. "Mr. Herriot," he said solemnly, You are the first landsman I have known who is not sick after last night." It made me feel good. As I have said, there is nothing clever about not being sick, but it was nice to know that I had something special in the way of stomachs. It's interesting to note that the only time I felt strange was when I struggled up to the deck for some fresh air and stood for some time looking out on the crazily swinging sea. After a while, as I hung onto a rail, I began to experience a sort of dizziness. It was a visual thing brought on somehow by watching the constant lifting and falling of the world about me. But it wasn't pleasant, and I went back to my cabin. In fact, I stayed in my bunk most of the day. It was the only safe place. Since my sheep had gone, I had nothing to do, and in any case it was dangerous for an inexperienced sailor like me to move about. I had one or two frights through being suddenly catapulted off my feet, and the danger of breaking a limb or splitting my head on a sharp projection was very real. So, it looked as though my life for the next few days was going to consist of lying on my back reading paperback books and eating. This was all very fine, but I am used to an active existence, and I felt that a very bloated Herriot was going to roll back to Derby. One hazard was that the faithful Nielsen now had me at his mercy. The galley was only a few yards away, and he kept opening my door and sliding in a crate of lager or a tray with a mug of coffee and bread and jam. Sometimes it was a more substantial offering, as when he marched into my cabin one afternoon, his body adjusting miraculously to the shifting slope of the floor. In one hand he held a plate and in the other a jug. On the plate rested a ring of mashed potatoes into which he had poured hot fat containing bacon and onions. He laughed eagerly. "This is big food of the poor in Denmark. Is called hot love." He watched with deep satisfaction as I consumed this strange dish. I relished every morsel, though dietitians would frown on it. The same dietitians would be horrified if they knew that this was merely an interlude, between a lunch of huge beefy things which looked like hamburgers, followed by a chocolate soup with unpronounceable rusks broken into it, and a dinner which consisted of a creation of sauerkraut cooked in butter, milk and flour and mixed with potatoes. I say nothing of the usual array of cold dishes always at my disposal to allay any lingering hunger pangs. Yes, there was no doubt about it. I was going to get fat. If I was on this ship long enough, I would probably finish up like Carl Rasmussen, the plump little mate. He was the champion eater of the ship. He ploughed impassively through the official meal, then started on the cold stuff of which he consumed a vast quantity before finishing with slice after slice of bread and dripping. The captain often looked at him with his gentle smile and patted his stomach wonderingly. I am not going to say that he had the biggest appetite I've ever seen, because I have come across some mighty troffers on the Dales farms, but he was undoubtedly in the top flight. I myself have a modest reputation in this field. Tristan often refers to me as the big eater of Darrowby, but I am not in Carl's class. He enthralled me. Over the schnapps, the captain told me that they had intended to go to Danzig on the way back, but the plan had been changed. We were going instead to the Polish port of Stettin. At least, those were their names when they were part of Germany. But they are now called Gdansk and Selsin, although the ship's officers refer to them by their German names. We had to pick up 800 pigs to transport to Lübeck. He hoped to arrive in Stettin, I think I'll stick to the old name, on Sunday, and get the pigs to Lübeck by Monday. But everything depended on the weather, which was still foul. With this gale against us, we were managing to do only 6 knots. As I scribbled in my diary, I kept sliding down to the cabin door. Then I had to drag myself back to the other end and start again. It looked like another sleepless night. Chapter 22. I let my heart fall into careless hands. Little Rose's voice piped in my ear as I guided my car over a stretch of rutted road. I had singing now to cheer the hours of driving. I was on my way back to dress a wound on a cow's back, and it was nice to hear the singing. But it was beginning to dawn on me that something better still was happening. I was starting all over again with another child. When Jimmy went to school, I missed his company in the car. But I did not realize that the whole thing was going to begin again with Rosie. The intense pleasure of showing them the farm animals and seeing their growing wonder at the things of the countryside, the childish chatter which never palled, the fun and the laughter which lightened my days. It all happened twice to me. The singing had originated in the purchase of a radiogram. Music has always meant a lot to me, and I owned a record player which gave me a lot of pleasure. Still, I felt I wanted something better, some means of reproducing more faithfully the sound of my favourite orchestras, singers, instrumentalists. Hi-fi outfits hadn't been heard of at that time, nor stereo, nor wraparound sound, nor any of the other things which have revolutionised the world of listening. The best the music lover could do was to get a good radiogram. After much agonising and reading of pamphlets and listening to advice from many quarters, I narrowed the list down to 3 models and made my choice by having them brought round to Skeldale House and playing the opening of the Beethoven Violin Concerto on one after the other, again and again. I must have driven the 2 men from the electric shop nearly mad, but at the end there was no doubt left in my mind. It had to be the Murphy, a handsome piece of furniture with a louvered front and graceful legs, and it bellowed out the full volume of the Philharmonia Orchestra without a trace of muzziness. I was enchanted with it. But there was one snag. It cost over £90, and that was an awful lot of money in 1950. "Helen," I said when we had installed it in the sitting room, "we've got to look after this thing. The kids can put records on my old player, but we must keep them away from the Murphy." Foolish words. The very next day, as I came in the front door, the passage was echoing with "Yippee-I-oo, yippee-I-ay, Ghost Riders in the sky." It was Bing Crosby's backup choir belting out the other side of the Careless Hands record, and the Murphy was giving it full value. I peeped round the sitting-room door. Ghost Riders had come to an end, and with her chubby little hands, Rosie removed the record, placed it in its cover, and marched pigtail swinging to the record cabinet. She selected another disc and was halfway across the floor when I waylaid her. "Which one is that?" I asked. "The Little Gingerbread Man," she replied. I looked at the label. It was, too. But how did she know? Because I had a whole array of these children's records, and many of them looked exactly the same colour, the same grouping of words, and Rosie, at the age of 3, could not read. She fitted the disc expertly on the turntable and set it going. I listened to the Little Gingerbread Man right through and watched as she picked out another record. I looked over her shoulder. "What is it this time?" "Tubby the Tuba." And indeed it was. I had an hour to spare, and Rosie gave me a recital. We went through Uncle Mac's nursery rhymes, The Happy Prince, Peter and the Wolf, and many of the immortal Bing to whom I was and am devoted. I was intrigued to find that her favourite Crosby record was not Please or How Deep is the Ocean or his other classics, but Careless Hands. This one had something special for her. At the end of the session, I decided that it was fruitless to try to keep Rosie and the Murphy apart. Whenever she was not out with me, she played with the radiogram. It was her toy. It all turned out for the best, too, because she did my precious acquisition no harm. And when she came with me on my round, she sang the things she had played so often and which were word-perfect in her mind. And I really loved that singing. Careless Hands soon became my favourite, too. There were 3 gates on the road to this farm, and we came bumping up to the first one now. The singing stopped abruptly. This was one of my daughter's big moments. When I drew up, she jumped from the car, strutted proudly to the gate, and opened it. She took this duty very seriously, and her small face was grave as I drove through. When she returned to take her place by my dog Sam on the passenger seat, I patted her knee. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said. "You're such a big help to me all the time." She didn't say anything but blushed and seemed to swell with importance. She knew I meant what I said, because opening gates is a chore. We negotiated the other 2 gates in similar manner and drove into the farmyard. The farmer, Mr. Binns, had shut the cow up in a ramshackle pen, with a passage which stretched from a dead end to the outside. Looking into the pen, I saw with some apprehension that the animal was a Galloway, black and shaggy, with a fringe of hair hanging over bad-tempered eyes. She lowered her head and twitched her tail as she watched me. Couldn't you have got her tied up, Mr. Binns? I asked. The farmer shook his head. Nay, I'm short of room, and this one spends most of her time on the moors. I could believe it. There was nothing domesticated about this animal. I looked down at my daughter. Usually I lifted her into hay racks or onto the top of walls while I worked, but I didn't want her anywhere near the Galloway. It's no place for you in there, Rosie, I said. Go and stand at the end of the passage, well out of the way. We went into the pen, and the cow danced about and did her best to run up the wall. I was pleasantly surprised when the farmer managed to drop a halter over her head. He backed her into a corner and held tightly to the shank. I looked at him doubtfully. Can you hold her? I think so, Mr. Bin replied a little breathlessly. You'll find place at the end of her back there. It was a most unusual thing. A big, discharging abscess near the root of the tail. And that tail was whipping perpetually from side to side, a sure sign of ill nature in a bovine. Gently I passed my fingers over the swelling, and like a natural reflex the hind foot lashed out, catching me a glancing blow on the thigh. I had expected this and got on with my exploration. How long she had this? The farmer dug his heels in and leant back on the rope. Oh, about 2 months. It keeps busting and filling up over and over again. Every time I thought it'd be the last, but it looks like it's never going to get right. What's the cause of it? I don't know, Mr. Binns. She must have had a wound there at some time and it's become infected. And of course, being on the back, drainage is poor. There's a lot of dead tissue which I'll have to clear away before the thing heals. I leant from the pen. Rosie, will you bring me my scissors, the cotton wool, and that bottle of peroxide? The farmer watched wonderingly as the tiny figure trotted to the car and came back with the 3 things. By go, little lass knows her way around. Oh, yes, I said, smiling. I'm not saying she knows where everything is in the car, but she's an expert on the things I use regularly. Rosie handed me my requirements and I reached over the door. Then she retreated to her place at the end of the passage. I began my work on the abscess. Since the tissue was necrotic, the cow couldn't feel anything as I snipped and swabbed, but that didn't stop the hind leg from pistoning out every few seconds. Some animals cannot tolerate any kind of interference, and this was one of them. I finished at last with a nice, wide, clean area, onto which I trickled the hydrogen peroxide. I have a lot of faith in this old remedy as a penetrative antiseptic when there was a lot of pus about, and I watched contentedly as it bubbled on the skin surface. The cow, however, did not seem to enjoy the sensation, because she made a sudden leap into the air, tore the rope from the farmer's hand, brushed me to one side, and made for the door. The door was closed, but it was a flimsy thing, and she went straight through it with a splintering crash. As the hairy black monster shot into the passage, I desperately willed her to turn left, but to my horror she went right, and after a wild scraping of her feet on the cobbles, began to thunder down towards the dead end, where my little daughter was standing. It was one of the worst moments of my life. As I dashed towards the broken door, I heard a small voice say, "Mama." There was no scream of terror, just that one quiet word. When I left the pen, Rosie was standing with her back against the end wall of the passage, and the cow was stationary, looking at her from a distance of 2 feet. The animal turned when she heard my footsteps, then whipped round in a tight circle and galloped past me into the yard. I was shaking when I lifted Rosie into my arms. She could easily have been killed, and a jumble of thoughts whirled in my brain. Why had she said Mama? I had never heard her use the word before. She always called Helen Mummy or Mum. Why had she been apparently unafraid? I didn't know the answers. All I felt was an overwhelming thankfulness. To this day I feel the same whenever I see that passage. Driving away, I remembered that something very like this had happened when Jimmy was out with me. It was not so horrific because he was playing in a passage with an open end, leading into a field, and he was not trapped when the cow I was working on broke loose and hurtled towards him. I could see nothing, but I heard a piercing yell of, "Ah!" before I rounded the corner. To my intense relief, Jimmy was streaking across the field to where my car was standing, and the cow was trotting away in another direction.
Thank you for listening to our audiobooks. We do our best to regularly upload quality books with clear narrations. Please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell icon so we can bring you more great books.
Thank you very much and we hope you enjoyed listening to your audiobook.